Deep in the remote Shimokita Peninsula of northern Japan, where civilization gives way to volcanic wasteland, stands a mountain that shouldn't exist. Mount Osore, a name that chills the blood of every local who dares speak it. The mountain's original name comes from the Ainu people, but when the Japanese settlers first laid eyes on this hellish landscape, they changed it to match their word Osore, meaning dread. Pure, paralyzing dread. This is not your typical sacred mountain. There are no cherry blossoms here, no peaceful meditation gardens. Instead, the air reeks of sulfur, the ground is stained blood red from iron deposits, and the very rocks seem to scream with the voices of the tormented. For over 1,000 years, the Japanese have believed Mount Osore to be the literal gateway between our world and the realm of the dead. It's one of Japan's 3 most sacred sites, but sacred doesn't mean safe. Sacred means dangerous. Sacred means the veil between worlds is paper thin. Every year, thousands of pilgrims climb this mountain not to find peace, but to speak with the dead. And the terrifying truth? The dead speak back. Local fishermen refuse to sail near the peninsula after dark. Taxi drivers won't drive the winding mountain roads past sunset. They know what happens when night falls on Mount Osore. They know the mountain comes alive with voices that shouldn't exist. But it's not just superstition keeping people away. There are witnesses, hundreds of them. Ordinary people who went to Mount Osore seeking closure and returned forever changed, carrying stories that will make your blood run cold. Mount Osore isn't just a mountain. It is an active volcanic complex that looks like something ripped from humanity as darkest nightmares. The landscape is so otherworldly that Buddhist monks declared it the physical manifestation of hell on earth. The mountain sits on 8 interconnected volcanoes, constantly venting poisonous gases that create an atmosphere of perpetual dread. The ground is littered with sulfur deposits that gleam like demon eyes in the dim light. Hot springs bubble with water so acidic it can dissolve flesh. At the heart of this hellscape lies Lake Usori, an unnaturally blue crater lake that reflects nothing. Visitors report staring into its depths and seeing shapes moving beneath the surface, shapes that look disturbingly human. The water is so toxic that no fish can survive, yet locals swear they've seen figures walking across its surface at dawn. The mountain's most unsettling feature is the sound. Constant, low-frequency rumbling emanates from deep within the earth, a sound that seems to burrow into your bones and whisper directly to your soul. Scientists claim it's just gas movement through underground chambers. The locals know better. Buddhist tradition holds that spirits of the dead must cross 7 rivers to reach the afterlife, and Mount Osore contains exactly 7 streams of scalding, sulfurous water. Each stream is said to represent a different type of sign, and legend claims the dead wade through these burning waters to purge their earthly crimes. The air itself feels different here, thicker, charged with an energy that makes electronics malfunction and compasses spin wildly. Visitors frequently report feelings of being watched, of hearing their names whispered on the wind, of seeing movement in their peripheral vision that vanishes when they turn to look. Temperature readings are erratic. Pockets of freezing air appear suddenly in the midst of volcanic heat, creating an environment where winter and hell coexist in the same breath. These cold spots are said to be where spirits gather, drawn by the warmth of living blood. Along the paths of Mount Osore stand thousands of small stone statues, their childlike faces weathered by centuries of wind and volcanic ash. These are Jizo statues, protectors of children and unborn souls. But on this mountain of the dead, they serve a far darker purpose. Each statue represents a child who died before their time. Miscarriages, stillbirths, infant deaths, children lost to disease or accident, their spirits are said to be trapped on Mount Osore, unable to cross into the afterlife because their lives were too brief to accumulate the spiritual weight necessary for the journey. Buddhist teaching holds that these children's souls wander the mountain paths, searching eternally for their mothers. But the legends surrounding Mount Osore's Jizo statues go far beyond traditional Buddhist theology. Here, the children aren't peaceful spirits seeking comfort. There's something far more disturbing. Local accounts describe the statues moving on their own. Not dramatic movement that could be dismissed as imagination, but subtle shifts. A head turned slightly to follow passing visitors. Tiny stone hands that weren't empty at sunset, but hold small offerings by dawn. Photography equipment malfunctions near the statues, producing images with dark shapes hovering around the stone figures. The most chilling reports come from parents who have lost children themselves. They're drawn to Mount Osore, seeking closure, hoping to connect with their deceased sons and daughters. But what they find among the Jizo statues isn't comfort. It has something that preys on parental love and guilt. In 1994, a woman named Akiko Tanaka made the pilgrimage to Mount Osore, 3 months after losing her 5-year-old daughter to leukemia. She brought the child's favorite doll to leave at one of the Jizo statues, following the traditional practice of offering toys to the stone guardians. As she knelt before a particular statue that reminded her of her daughter, Akiko heard something that stopped her heart. Her daughter's voice calling her name. Not from the statue, but from somewhere behind her. She turned to see a small figure in the distance, partially obscured by volcanic steam, wearing the same blue dress her daughter had been buried in. The figure beckoned to her, moving slowly away from the path toward the more dangerous areas of the mountain, where sulfur vents create deadly gas pockets. Akiko followed, later telling investigators she couldn't help herself. It was definitely her daughter's voice calling to her. For 3 hours, she pursued the figure deeper into the volcanic wasteland. The child always stayed just far enough ahead to remain indistinct, but close enough that Akiko could hear her calling. "Mama, come play with me. Come play where it's warm forever." Only the intervention of a search party prevented Akiko from walking directly into a concealed sulfur vent that would have killed her instantly. When rescuers found her, she was standing at the edge of a pit filled with boiling, poisonous water, reaching out toward empty air and calling her daughter's name. But here is what makes this account truly terrifying. The search party reported that they too could hear a child's voice coming from the direction of the sulfur pit. Not Akiko's voice echoing, but a separate, smaller voice that seemed to be answering her calls. Similar incidents occur with disturbing regularity. Park rangers estimate that at least twice per year, they must rescue visitors who become lost while following what they claim are the voices or apparitions of dead children. The victims are always parents who have lost children themselves, and they always describe being led toward the most dangerous areas of the mountain. In some cases, rescue isn't possible. Search teams occasionally find bodies in locations that should be impossible to reach: deep crevices, isolated ledges, areas that would require climbing equipment to access safely. The victims are always found in positions suggesting they were reaching toward something, their faces frozen in expressions of desperate joy. But the children's spirits aren't just dangerous to grieving parents. Local children report far more direct encounters with what they call the mountain children, spirits that appear to living boys and girls, inviting them to play games that could prove fatal. 9-year-old Hiroshi Sato was visiting Mount Osore with his family in the summer of 2003 when he wandered away from the tourist group. His parents found him 2 hours later, sitting cross-legged in front of a cluster of Jizo statues, having an animated conversation with empty air. When questioned about what he was doing, Hiroshi explained that he had been playing hide-and-seek with the other children. He described them in detail: a girl with long black hair wearing a white dress, 2 boys in old-fashioned school uniforms, and a baby that crawled on hands and knees, but never seemed to get dirty, despite the volcanic ash covering the ground. What disturbed his parents most was Hiroshi's matter-of-fact description of the games these spirit children wanted to play. They wanted me to lie down in the hot water to see who could stay under longest. They said it doesn't hurt after the first few minutes. They said I could stay and play with them forever. if I was brave enough. Photography taken at Jizo statue sites often reveals anomalies that can't be explained by equipment malfunction or environmental factors. Images show small handprints on the statues that weren't visible to the naked eye, dark shapes moving between the stone figures. And most disturbingly, what appear to be additional children in group photos. Children who weren't present when the pictures were taken. Professional photographer Kenji Yamamoto spent 3 days documenting the Jizo statues in 2011 for a book about Japanese folklore. When he developed his photographs, he discovered that every single image contained the same anomaly. A small figure in outdated clothing standing behind one of the statues, always partially obscured, but clearly present. The figure appeared to be following his movements throughout the site. In photos taken early in the day, it appeared in the background. By afternoon, it had moved closer to the foreground. In the final photographs, taken just before sunset, the figure was standing directly beside Yamamoto himself, though he had been completely alone at the time. Most disturbing of all was the figure S-face in the final photograph, clearly visible as a young boy of perhaps 8 years old, but with eyes that held intelligence far beyond his apparent age. The boy was smiling, but it wasn't the innocent expression of a child. It was the calculating smile of something that had been waiting patiently for decades to catch the photographer's attention. Yamamoto never returned to Mount Osore. 6 months after his visit, he was found dead in his Tokyo apartment, apparently having succumbed to severe dehydration. His neighbors reported hearing the sound of children playing in his apartment for 3 days before his body was discovered, though no children lived in the building and none had been seen entering or leaving his unit. The children of Mount Osore aren't seeking peace or comfort from the living. They're seeking playmates. And once they've chosen someone to join their eternal games, they're patient enough to wait for the perfect moment to extend their invitation. At the heart of Mount Osore lies something that shouldn't exist in our rational world, a volcanic crater that speaks. Not the rumbling of shifting earth or the hiss of escaping gas, but actual voices, human voices, calling names. The crater is approximately 800 meters across, filled with toxic water that glows an unnatural blue-green color even in dim light. The water temperature averages 85 degrees Celsius, hot enough to cook flesh from bone in minutes. Yet people report hearing voices coming from deep beneath its surface, voices so clear they seem to be speaking directly into the listener's ear. Scientific instruments have been lowered into the crater on multiple occasions, recording temperature, chemical composition, and acoustic properties. The equipment consistently malfunctions at depths below 50 meters, transmitting nothing but static before losing signal entirely. The few recordings recovered before equipment failure contain sounds that shouldn't exist, human speech in languages that predate recorded Japanese history. Dr. Yuki Nakamura, a volcanologist from Tokyo University, led a research expedition to Mount Osore in 2007 with the goal of definitively explaining the acoustic phenomena reported by visitors. Her team brought sophisticated recording equipment designed to identify the source of what they assumed would be natural gas, movement creating sound patterns that the human brain interpreted as speech. What they recorded instead defied explanation. Clear human voices speaking in modern Japanese, calling out names and phrases that were verifiably connected to real people who had died in the region over the past century. The voices provided specific details about deaths, relationships, and events that were later confirmed through historical records. Most disturbing was a voice that called Dr. Nakamura by name, providing details about her childhood that only she and her deceased grandmother would have known. The voice claimed to be her grandmother, but instead of words of comfort, it delivered a warning. The mountain is waking up. The old barriers are failing. Soon we won't need to whisper from below. Dr. Nakamura's expedition was cut short when 3 team members reported hearing their own names being called from the crater. When they looked into the water, they claimed to see faces looking back at them, not reflections, but distinct human faces floating just beneath the surface. Two of the researchers had to be physically restrained to prevent them from attempting to dive into the boiling water. The official report classified the expedition as inconclusive due to equipment failure. Dr. Nakamura never published her findings and refused all subsequent requests for interviews about Mount Osore. She died 2 years later in what was ruled a suicide, though family members insist she showed no signs of depression and had never expressed suicidal thoughts. The voices from the crater don't speak to everyone. They seem to target specific individuals, often people with strong connections to the region or those dealing with recent loss. Tourist groups can spend hours at the crater's edge, hearing nothing unusual, while a single person might be singled out for direct communication with something claiming to be a deceased loved one. Monk Jishin Takada has served at Mount Osore's temple for over 30 years and has become the unofficial chronicler of crater voice encounters. His handwritten records, kept in a locked drawer at the temple, document hundreds of incidents involving voices from the water. According to Monk Takeda's records, the voices follow patterns that suggest intelligence rather than random natural phenomena. They know personal information about the people they address. They reference current events and recent deaths. Most unnervingly, they sometimes provide information about future deaths that later prove accurate. In one documented case from 2015, a voice from the crater told visitor Michiko Hayashi that her husband would die in a car accident within 3 days. Hayashi dismissed the experience as stress-induced hallucination. Her husband was a careful driver with no health problems. 3 days later, her husband was killed when his vehicle was struck by a truck whose driver had fallen asleep at the wheel. But the crater voices don't just predict deaths, they sometimes seem to cause them. Multiple visitors have reported being told by voices to come down and join us, or being given specific instructions on how to bypass the safety barriers around the crater S-edge. Several people have had to be forcibly removed from the area after becoming fixated on entering the water. The most well-documented incident occurred in 1999 when businessman Satoshi Kimura visited Mount Osore during a company retreat. Witnesses reported seeing him standing at the crater's edge, having what appeared to be an animated conversation with someone they couldn't see. When colleagues approached, they could hear both sides of the conversation. Kimura's voice and a second voice that seemed to be coming from the water itself. The unseen speaker was providing Kimura with detailed information about financial improprieties at his company, including the location of hidden documents that would expose embezzlement by his business partner. The voice claimed to be Kimura's deceased father, offering to help him recover the stolen money in exchange for joining him in the warm place where numbers don't matter. Security footage from the temple shows Kimura standing at the crater's edge for over 2 hours, occasionally nodding and responding to what appears to be empty air. Audio enhancement of the footage reveals faint sounds that could be interpreted as speech, though the source cannot be identified. Kimura never returned from Mount Osore. His body was found floating in the crater 3 days later, though how he managed to bypass multiple safety barriers and enter the water without being seen remains unexplained. The documents his father's voice had mentioned were found exactly where specified, leading to the arrest of his business partner for embezzlement. But perhaps most disturbing of all are the collective voice events, incidents where multiple witnesses hear the same voices simultaneously. These usually occur during the mountain's festival periods, when larger numbers of visitors are present. During the 2018 Autumn Festival, over 40 people reported hearing a chorus of voices emerging from the crater, men, women, and children, all speaking in unison. The voices recited a list of names, later identified as every person who had died on Mount Osore over the past century. The recitation lasted approximately 20 minutes, with each name spoken clearly and distinctly. But the list didn't stop with historical deaths. The voices concluded by naming 5 people who were present at the festival that day. describing them as soon to join us in the warm place where all voices become one. Within 6 months, all 5 named individuals had died under various circumstances, natural causes, accidents, and 1 apparent suicide. Each death occurred exactly as described by the voices, though no one had recorded or written down the specific predictions at the time. The crater's voices are becoming more frequent and more detailed in their communications. They no longer limit themselves to simple warnings or predictions. Now they provide elaborate descriptions of the afterlife as experienced on Mount Osore, painting a picture of existence that sounds less like traditional Buddhist paradise and more like eternal imprisonment in volcanic stone. They speak of consciousness preserved in mineral form, awareness trapped in crystallized sulfur, souls bound to the mountain itself until it finally erupts and carries them all into oblivion. And increasingly, they speak of preparing for something they call the Great Awakening, a time when the voices will no longer need to whisper from below, because they will have enough power to walk among the living once again. Lake Usori sits like a sapphire eyeing the skull of Mount Osore, its waters so acidic they can dissolve metal, so toxic that nothing living can survive beneath its surface. Yet witnesses consistently report seeing figures walking across the water at dawn, casting no reflection in its mirror-like surface. The lake formed in an ancient volcanic crater, fed by underground springs that carry dissolved minerals from deep within the earth. The water's supernatural blue color comes from dissolved copper compounds, creating a lake so visually striking that it seems artificial, like liquid jewelry set into barren rock. But Lake Usore's most disturbing characteristic is in its toxic beauty. It has the complete absence of normal lake sounds. No lapping of water against shore, no wind-driven waves, no sounds of any kind. The lake exists in perfect, unnatural silence that extends to the air above its surface. Birds refuse to fly over the water, and even insects avoid the immediate shoreline. This silence makes the phenomena reported by witnesses even more unsettling. In a place where sound seems to die, people report hearing whispers coming from the water itself. Not voices carried by wind, but speech that seems to emerge directly from the liquid. Photography professor Naomi Suzuki documented a particularly disturbing encounter during a pre-dawn shoot in March 2009. She had positioned herself on the lake's western shore to capture sunrise reflections, expecting to photograph the interplay of light and the water's unusual coloration. Instead, her telephoto lens captured something impossible, a procession of human figures walking in single file across the lake's surface. The figures appeared to be wearing traditional Japanese funeral garments, moving slowly but purposefully from the far shore toward the center of the lake. Suzuki snapped dozens of photographs, her camera's autofocus working perfectly despite the dim light. But when she looked up from her viewfinder to observe the scene directly, the lake surface was empty. Returning to her camera, the figures were still visible through the lens, now clearly showing individual faces with expressions of profound sadness. The developed photographs show approximately 30 figures walking on the water, their images perfectly sharp and detailed. Enhancement revealed that several faces matched individuals from old newspaper obituaries, people who had died on or near Mount Osore over the past decade. Most disturbing was the final figure in the procession, a woman whose face matched Suzuki's own features, but aged by several decades. Suzuki fled the scene immediately, but the photographs remain as evidence of something that shouldn't exist. She never returned to Mount Osore and refuses to discuss the incident beyond providing copies of the photographs to researchers. The walking figures aren't the lake's only impossible inhabitants. Visitors report seeing shapes moving beneath the water as surface, not the distorted reflections of clouds or trees, but distinct forms that seem to be swimming in water, too toxic to support life. These underwater shapes appear to be reaching upward, their movements suggesting attempts to break through the surface tension and emerge into the air above. On several occasions, Witnesses have reported seeing hands breaking the surface of the lake, followed by arms and shoulders, before the figures sink back into the depths. But the most terrifying encounters involve direct interaction between the living and whatever inhabits Lake Usori. The lake seems to call to certain individuals, drawing them toward its shores with a compulsion that overrides rational thought. Local guide Taro Yamada has worked on Mount Osore for 15 years, leading tourist groups and maintaining safety protocols. He's witnessed multiple incidents where visitors become fixated on entering the lake, insisting they can see someone beneath the water who needs help. In one incident from 2016, a middle-aged woman broke away from Yamada's tour group and ran toward the lake, claiming her drowned son was calling to her from beneath the surface. When Yamada caught up with her, she was waist-deep in the toxic water, reaching downward as if trying to grab something. The woman insisted she could see her son clearly, describing his face and the clothes he was wearing when he drowned 3 years earlier. She begged Yamada to help her pull him out, becoming violent when he tried to remove her from the water. It took 3 people to drag her back to shore. The woman suffered severe chemical burns from the lake water, requiring months of treatment. But even while hospitalized, she maintained that her son had been real, that he had spoken to her from beneath the surface, and that he was still waiting for her to return and bring him home. Hospital staff reported that the woman would wake from sleep, screaming her son's name, claiming she could hear him calling to her from far away. She died 2 weeks after discharge, found floating in a local river with no signs of struggle. The coroner ruled it accidental drowning, though the woman had been an excellent swimmer with no history of depression. The lake's influence isn't limited to those who approach its shores. People who photograph the lake from safe distances often discover anomalies in their images that were invisible when the pictures were taken. Digital cameras malfunction near the water, producing images with strange color distortions, unexplained shadows, and recurring appearance of human-shaped figures. But perhaps most disturbing are the reflection discrepancies reported by visitors. People looking into the lake don't see their own reflections. They see other faces looking back at them. Sometimes the faces are those of deceased relatives, sometimes complete strangers, but always individuals who died on or near Mount Osore. These false reflections aren't static images. They move independently of the person looking into the water, sometimes mouthing words or making gestures that suggest they're trying to communicate. In several documented cases, people have reported their false reflections pointing toward specific locations on the mountain, leading to the discovery of previously unknown grave sites. Lake Usori represents the ultimate mystery of Mount Osore, a place where the laws of physics seem suspended and the boundary between life and death becomes meaningless. The water that should preserve nothing instead preserves everything, trapping souls in liquid crystal while they wait for their chance to return to the world above. As climate change affects volcanic activity worldwide, Lake Usori's water levels have begun fluctuating in ways that concern both scientists and local spiritual leaders. The lake is growing deeper and more active, with new thermal vents opening along its bottom. And with each change in the lake's composition, witnesses report seeing more figures walking its surface, more hands reaching up from its depths. The dead are gathering beneath Lake Usori, and their numbers are growing. At the entrance to Mount Osore's hellscape stands Ensuji Temple, the only permanent human settlement on this mountain of the dead. The temple serves as both spiritual guardian and last warning to those foolish enough to venture deeper into the volcanic wasteland. Built in 862 CE, Ensuji has stood witness to over 1,000 years of supernatural activity. The temple's records, kept in meticulous detail by generations of monks, document phenomena that would challenge the sanity of any rational person. But the monks who choose to serve here are not entirely rational. They cannot be and still function in this place where reality bends around the presence of so many restless dead. The temple's architecture reflects its grim purpose. Unlike typical Japanese temples with their emphasis on harmony and natural beauty, Ensuji is built like a fortress. Its walls are thick stone designed to contain rather than welcome. Its windows small and barred, its very design suggesting that something inside needs to be kept from getting out. The temple houses artifacts that would be considered cursed by any reasonable standard. Ancient scrolls written in languages that predate Japanese writing, but which somehow communicate directly to anyone who views them. Stone tablets covered in symbols that seem to shift and change when observed directly. And most disturbing of all, a collection of personal items left by visitors who ventured into the mountain and never returned. These abandoned belongings aren't displayed as memorials. They rekept because they continue to exhibit supernatural activity long after their owners vanished. Watches that tick backward, counting down to unknown dates. Photographs that show different images each time they're viewed. Jewelry that grows cold to the touch whenever someone speaks the name of its former owner. Brother Kenjiro has served as head monk at Ensuji for 12 years, making him the longest-serving temple leader in over a century. Most monks can tolerate Mount Osore for no more than 3 years before the constant exposure to supernatural phenomena drives them to request transfer to more conventional temples. Brother Kenjiro's daily routine includes tasks no other monk in Japan must perform. Each morning, he walks the temple grounds collecting offerings that appeared overnight: flowers, incense, and food left by invisible hands. The offerings are never placed during daylight hours when living visitors might observe the process. They simply appear at dawn, arranged with care around statues and shrines. More disturbing are the messages left with these mystery offerings. Notes written in perfect Japanese, but in handwriting that matches no living person. The messages are always requests for specific prayers to be said for individuals who died on the mountain, often decades ago. The requests include details about the deceased that Brother Kenjiro must verify through the temple's historical records before performing the requested ceremonies. But the most challenging aspect of Brother Kenjiro's duties involves managing the temple's midnight visitors, spirits who appear regularly and expect to be treated as living pilgrims. These apparitions maintain the appearance and mannerisms of ordinary people, but they cast no shadows and leave no footprints in the volcanic ash. The spirit visitors follow temple protocols perfectly, bowing respectfully, making appropriate offerings, and sitting in meditation for precisely the correct duration. They never speak, but their presence fills the temple with an atmosphere of barely contained grief that affects everyone present. Brother Kenjiro has learned to distinguish between spirit visitors and living humans through subtle signs. The way supernatural visitors' clothes never accumulate volcanic dust, how they never seem to blink, and most tellingly, how they position themselves to avoid reflecting surfaces. Mirrors and polished metal surfaces reveal the truth about these midnight pilgrims. They cast no reflection at all. The temple's most sacred and terrifying artifact is the Death Register, a leather-bound book that records every person who has died on Mount Osore since the temple's founding. The register's pages are filled with names written in dozens of different hands, spanning over a millennium of deaths. But here's what makes the register truly supernatural. It continues to update itself. New names appear in the register before deaths are officially reported. The handwriting changes to match historical periods, suggesting that the register is being maintained by the spirits of former monks who died while serving at the temple. Most disturbing of all, the register occasionally includes names of people who are still alive, entries that invariably prove accurate within days or weeks of their appearance. Brother Kenjiro checks the death register every morning as part of his duties, though he admits the task has become increasingly difficult as the list of future deaths grows longer. The register now contains dozens of names of living people, suggesting that Mount Osore is preparing for a period of increased supernatural activity. The temple's main hall contains a statue of Jizo that weeps real tears. Not condensation or water seepage, but actual salt water that flows from the stone eyes in response to the mountain's spiritual activity. The tears increase during periods when the mountain claims new lives, and locals believe the statue mourns for souls trapped between worlds. But perhaps most disturbing of all is what happens in the temple during Mount Osore's twice-yearly festivals. These gatherings draw thousands of pilgrims seeking to contact deceased loved ones, but they also draw something else, a massive increase in supernatural activity that transforms the temple into something approaching hell on earth. During festival periods, the temple's walls literally vibrate with unseen energy. Temperatures fluctuate wildly, electronics fail completely, and the very air becomes thick with the presence of spirits, desperate to communicate with the living. Brother Kenjiro describes these festivals as managing a riot of the dead. Mount Osore's supernatural activity isn't confined to ancient legends or folklore. Modern visitors with cameras, recording equipment, and scientific training continue to document phenomena that challenge our understanding of reality. These contemporary witnesses bring credibility to claims that might otherwise be dismissed as superstition. Dr. James Morrison, a paranormal researcher from the University of Edinburgh, spent 6 months studying Mount Osore in 2019. His team brought electromagnetic field detectors, infrared cameras, and digital recording equipment designed to document and analyze supernatural claims scientifically. What they found exceeded their most optimistic expectations for paranormal evidence. Their equipment registered electromagnetic anomalies consistent with theories about spiritual energy. Infrared cameras captured heat signatures of human-shaped forms in areas where no living people were present. Digital recorders picked up voices speaking in clear Japanese, though no living speakers were nearby. Most compelling was their documentation of what they termed temporal echoes, recordings that seemed to capture conversations from the past, playing out in present-day locations. These weren't faint whispers or unclear sounds, but full conversations between people who had died decades earlier, discussing events that historical records confirmed had actually occurred. But Dr. Morrison's research came to an abrupt end when 3 team members reported being followed by something they couldn't see. Their equipment registered a presence moving with them, maintaining a consistent distance of approximately 3 meters. When they attempted to approach this invisible follower, their instruments detected rapid temperature drops and electromagnetic spikes that overloaded sensitive electronics. On their final night, all team members reported the same dream simultaneously. Visions of Mount Osore as it appeared centuries ago, populated by figures in ancient clothing who seemed aware of being observed. The figures in the dream pointed toward specific locations on the mountain, locations that, when investigated the following day, revealed previously unknown burial sites. Dr. Morrison's official report concluded that Mount Osore exhibits persistent anomalous phenomena that warrant further investigation. Privately, he admitted that his team had encountered evidence of consciousness surviving bodily death, but acknowledged that publishing such conclusions would destroy their academic credibility. More recently, social media has become a source of Mount Osore documentation that bypasses traditional academic gatekeeping. Visitors routinely post photographs and videos showing anomalies that should and exist, shadows moving independently of their sources, figures appearing in backgrounds where no people were present, equipment malfunctions that create images of impossible beauty and terror. But these digital witnesses face their own unique horrors. Several people who posted Mount Osore content online reported that their accounts were accessed by unknown parties who posted additional content, photographs taken from locations the original users had never visited, showing angles and perspectives that seemed to be captured from impossible viewpoints. Most disturbing are the comments left on these posts by accounts with no profile information, no posting history, and usernames that match the names of people who died on Mount Osore. These ghost accounts leave messages that reference private details about the original posters' lives, suggesting knowledge that no living person should possess. The mountain's influence now extends into the digital realm, suggesting that whatever inhabits Mount Osore is adapting to modern technology, just as it once adapted to ancient spiritual practices. The dead are learning to use our tools against us, and Mount Osore serves as their base of operations. As we speak, new witnesses are arriving at Mount Osore, drawn by curiosity or grief, or something they can't name. They carry cameras and recording devices, convinced that modern technology will help them understand what previous generations could only fear. They're wrong. Mount Osore doesn't reveal its secrets. It collects those who seek to uncover them. The mountain grows stronger with each new soul it claims, more cunning with each modern mind it corrupts. And somewhere in the volcanic depths beneath Lake Usori, in the spaces between the Jizo statues, in the whispers rising from the crater, the dead are preparing for something that will make everything we've discussed seem like a gentle warning. Mount Osore is not just a gateway to the dead. It's a gathering place, a staging area, a beachhead for an invasion that began over 1,000 years ago and is finally approaching completion. The mountain is waking up. The barriers are failing. And soon, the dead won't need to whisper from the shadows because they have enough power to walk in the light. Some say if you listen carefully on quiet nights, even from hundreds of miles away, you can hear Mount Osore calling your name. Others claim that once the mountain knows you exist, it will never stop trying to bring you home. But perhaps the most terrifying truth about Mount Osore is this: it's not unique. There are other places like it around the world, other mountains where the dead gather and wait. Mount Osore is just the one we know about, the one that's been patient enough to let us document its secrets, the one that's been preparing us for what comes next. And now that you know its name, that you've heard its stories, Mount Osore knows about you too. Welcome to the Mountain of the Dead. Your room has been waiting.